다 다 가지네 제정가죠 다원이 하스지 슝디지랑가죠 퇴바라고 지다 지비 계자로와 디인도다 퇴바 계셔 뭐 임바디 응연라 당부 퇴바 계셔 뭐 임바디 아니 된다 직제 링예고의 직도
For the last 2.5 months, we've studied and we've been going through this text, and of the various steps, the first thing that's significant to pay attention to, or the first thing to pay heed to, is the necessity or the importance of hearing and reflection.
퇴디 가르치는 것도 퇴고였을람나 아니 랑도 출신 용의 제도 랑도 출신도 주베기 제도 아주 퇴바시고
So the hearing or listening to the teachings, the purpose of doing that is to be able to have a good idea or a correct understanding of what is to be adopted and what is to be abandoned.
다 랑도 출신도 주발라 아니 당봉회라 디 야구지 시에고로 와 랑도 출신 두벌 셔발라 응회라 랑도 실루 제단데 가리 랑고래 가리 돌고래 랑자 도적이 네 상마 야구신 시에고로 와
Before being able to accurately engage in practices that then lead to abandoning those things that are not relevant and then taking on those that are necessary, before being able to do that, it's essential to have an idea of what it is or to know correctly what that is.
다 시에발라 지단 랑도르 get니 네 셔라 야촌보요래 단단 가서 니리기 직den기 초와도 템베 랑도르 가서 셔라 제거로 봐. 다 단단 가서 디치고 계제 말어 봐. 다단 가서 랑도 제디 아니 셈르 시드 중에 랑도르디 셈르 시드 중발라 가리 랑고래 가리 돌고 그래 띵아도
when one, generally, even in a very ordinary way, in things that we do ordinarily, there are things that we do and then there's things that we abstain from. But this is not what we mean over here when we say adopt and abandon. We're talking about what is necessary that needs to be done and what needs to be abstained from or abandoned for being able to give rise to peace in the mind. So it's with reference to the mind gaining peace or the mind attaining a state of well-being and peace.
디인도니 랑도 수신도 대답을 랑도 수신도 용해라 아니 도마를 시에고 그래 시에발라 아니 뭐나 퇴고라 봐. 디인도 퇴바마 집어 조사요 말이에요.
To be able to engage accurately in the actions that lead to this well-being or this peace and abstain from actions that would disturb it or that hinder it, one needs to know what they are, and to be able to know what they are, one has to hear or listen to teachings that talk about it first.
다디 당보 퇴바디 개전부 이인바이 금전 디체 금전 디동의 기체도 좀 버셔주 두바야 야스 슈누트로야 토마르 김빵체 게시 빵체 아니 나라 시용도 당보 퇴바 체도와
And because hearing or listening or hearing over here is the first step, and it's particularly relevant and important in this process, which is why Prince Siddhartha, when the first thing that he did when he left the palace and he went to the forest, was he looked for or he seeked out teachers from whom he could go and receive teachings or listen to their teachings.
당부 퇴바 가르치는 거에서 디 김전다다 셈라 녀버체.
Which is why the reason for listening or hearing being essential, fundamental in the beginning, one should have a clear idea of why one needs to listen or hear in the beginning.
다 퇴바체 용도 아니 랑도르기 네데비 슝시다 망고 요래 랑도르기 네데비 게겐시다 망고 요래 랑도르기 네데비 덤바 망고 시다 요래 아니
And when one sets out to then listen to or hear various teachings, you will find many texts that are explaining different methods of what to abandon and what to adopt. Different teachers who are giving different methods of what to abandon and what to adopt, and then many masters who give different presentations of this.
디 인도다 퇴용도 야 디 탑람디 딱다 디 랑괴 등문의 레샤 디 도르고에 등문의 레샤스 간다 다 덤바 대다 대기 마 송용도 딩문의 두 딩문의 레샤 딩문의 레민도 세게 릭더 미릭 예와디 수치기를라나 수수치고봐.
Now, when one hears all these different presentations, to be able to be sure that what one has heard is correct, or this that is being said is accurate and this is inaccurate, this is correct and this is incorrect, this distinction of being able to distinguish between what these different things that one is hearing, which one of those is correct and incorrect, is something that each one has to individually do.
마땡이 되게 디 딱다레다 디 제고레다 슬라니 캐나조 아니 디 켈림이 주스 당 침바이나 아니 룽기제랑 세드레 대베제랑 세드 차버마도 원은 슈기제랑 세드 작마레.
If the way then one engages in such practices once they have been told is solely because the person who's speaking them or the one who's instructing us says this is correct and this is to be done, which is the only reason why then you follow them or you engage in what they've done or you cultivate what they have told, then that way of following it's known as following based on faith or following based on scripture, followers of scripture or faith. And that doesn't entail following through reasoning or through one's own ability to analyze and reason it out. And so one is not a follower of reason, one is a follower of scripture, if that's how one proceeds.
So that dendigi rigda mirigdi teda mitedi susorangi takjeshini jegugi yoba indi ani takje chiludi shengorwa de indi tayanda de shegori.
Which is why, since the eventual decision of whether it is accurate or inaccurate has to be done by oneself, one needs to know how to test and how to see whether what one is listening to is correct or incorrect. And for that, what one needs to know is what makes a certain reason accurate or what is inaccurate. And so one needs to know a presentation of correct signs or correct reasons.
rigda mirik je jumze yandal ten je gu yoba yindu jumze yanda ge jodan di mashe ba tame yimba yindu ani riglam jangye di thangbo gochuge di jumzen dir.
And then, because to be able to make this distinction, it all eventually boils down to being able to understand what entails accurate reasoning and what entails inaccurate reasoning. To be able to have a good understanding of what reasons are valid or what are invalid, then in the beginning, when one sets out, because it is indispensable that one learns this skill, is why in the beginning, the first thing that we learn or the first thing that is taught is how to reason or the way to reason, the path of reasoning.
당보 아주 장애디 운동 일레데 슝 당보 퇴바치 아이데 말에 슝 당보 장애데 가리 장고래 당보 장애데 릴람 장애데 nenga dit다.
Which is why the first thing that one has to learn are not the texts that teach us these methods on how to attain liberation or higher status. But what one needs to learn before having access or being able to understand those texts is how to reason. So the first texts that we learn are texts that teach us how to reason.
Oh yeah, this
is why in the first year, what we have put as our, curriculum or the subjects that we study are the texts that teach us how to reason.
Oh yeah. 다 riglam di pyeje chedan de shen sabe jela ta ngushi shung jang de ko zukre.
Then once you have learned how to reason and once one has acquired this skill, then after that one actually starts a study of texts.
Di indu ta ngushi shung jang de la ngushi shung kari jang gu yor se du ngon to le zambe ngon to gi chele zambe langja do torja kari yimi she go chik ngele 톱장 예legle zambe langgoye do torgoye kari yimi chik ta shegoye langdorgi nedi nguntogi chöle zambe chikda ngelegi chöle zambe chik ni tini nalo dyursta.
Then when one starts studying the texts, when we try and see what those texts are, then the texts that we study can be divided into two categories. Texts that teach us what is to be abandoned and what is to be adopted with the aim of favorable birth in mind, or like a higher status. So what are the practices to be abandoned and cultivated with the objective of a favorable birth or a higher state? And then the practices that are to be abandoned and cultivated with the goal of attaining what we call definitive goodness, but either liberation or Buddhahood. So based on these two goals, the practices that are taught of what one should cultivate and abandon to attain these two goals, it's okay, is the content of the text that we study.
톱자 딩이부디 멤버도 초기 개발지바이나 녜레디 초체 아니 온도 멤버와.
If between these two, higher status or favorable birth and a definitive goodness, we consider which one is more, which is more superior or which is inferior, then definitive goodness is superior.
다 톱이 림바원도 지는 운동을 톱 녜레젤 톱기로 봐.
So even though definitive goodness is superior as far as an objective goes, in terms of the order in which one attains these two, first one has to attain a favorable state, and then one later only attains definitive goodness.
이내양 슝라 장용도 당보 녜레를 쌈베 최텔라 응을 장체 되니 운동이 최 운동 톱자 지에베더니 답람되죠 제일 장애들.
But again, despite the order in which they arise, first, even though there may be higher status or favorable births before one can attain a definitive goodness, when we study, what one has to study first are the teachings or an explanation of the paths and the means to attain definitive goodness first, and after that is clear, then later on, one learns the methods and techniques required to have a favorable state.
운동이 최를 쌈베 랑도르 체윤도 조 아니 덴바 상기기 송라 이시체네 조고에 야 망골리기를 봐.
Because when you're talking about what is the path or what are the various methods required to have attained favorable states, in the teachings of the Buddha, for example, there are many things that one is going to have to accept or believe more or less out of faith.
디인도 응엘라 아니 덴바셰제도 상기 임바다 세미지부 임바디 응엘라 차상 야구지 시에차와지 중바이나 아니 운동이 최를 쌈베 랑도르 수신도 제라 시라기 누바 춘보여.
And because that's the case, before being able to have faith in other aspects of the teachings that require this kind of faith, then being able to have established that the Buddha is an accurate teacher, is a reliable teacher, or the Buddha is an infallible being, then becomes extremely important. First to establish that, so then the other aspects of the teachings one can, the way in which one will be able to access them or approach them becomes a lot easier if one is able to prove earlier that the Buddha is infallible.
그래. 소소 다 디인도 응엘라 녜레레 쌈베 최라 퇴삼체디 당부드래.
Which is why the teachings that teach or the teachings that show what is to be abandoned and cultivated to attain definitive goodness are the first teachings or the first texts that we study.
다 녜레라양 타바도 탐지신명이 여바인도 안 당보 타바도 제베 남샤 진지말로바 장 슝나 장야직 니버디 아니 신의 탐지신명 고반다 제베 슝나 장야 디니드다.
And again, because definitive goodness is further divided into liberation for oneself and complete Buddhahood or omniscience, because those are the two goals, when one speaks of definitive goodness, there are these two goals that are subsumed within definitive goodness. Of the texts and the teachings that teach these two, the teachings relevant to attain liberation are first studied.
어드레샤. 다 디인도 아니 당보 녜렉 타르바던 제베 람긴 남샤 차상와 지글라 응엘라 당보 퇴제 장국의 여바인도 간주 루니베기 로센디 아니 딩심미다서 주르기 남샤 조 슝된디기 세만남들 리우니바디 간주 장야디 금제디르.
Because when one sets out, one first studies texts relevant with attaining definitive goodness. And amongst that, between liberation and Buddhahood, first we study the texts that are pertinent to how to attain liberation. This is why the second year, which is what we did this year, what we studied is the second chapter of the Pramanavartika, because it gives the explanation for how to attain a resultant state of liberation and the path that leads to it.
That semanamje ki liunibe so liunibe ki shung di thone dijimi da shuru ki jodan cha sangwa do janche tama dela dene tabar duje ki lam dela 가장 먼저 주식이 남세야 돼. 주식이 남세야 되라 남직 모두 민도 디 가르레샤스 남에도 베셔라드 제도세 디간을 밥사 디간을 밥용도 아니 신이 다음에 고아디 아니 두도마도 되는 고아직 디네 야 제인데 셈잠바도 제제 야 다음에 고아 참무직 디네 야 렙제 아니 우마바기 다음에 고아 참무직 도시제 아니 다음에 비 추술도 쌈베 아니 덴버니기 남샤 좁다오마니 제제 턴주비 바르기 남샤 참모 바르기 아니 우미기 흉디 차상화직 오네시나 달로 도구고요. 롭센 냠도 도구고래.
And if you remember, what we did this year was, when we speak of the path that leads to liberation, of the various paths that there might be, the one that is the liberating path, or the one that leads to liberation, is solely the wisdom that realizes selflessness. And so gaining that certainty then makes it essential to have a good understanding of what the lack of a self is, or what selflessness is. And so when we start out to understand that what the meaning of selflessness is, after having gained certainty that it is the only liberating path, or the only path that liberates and leads to liberation, then there are different ways in which selflessness is understood. And so we start with a coarser understanding of selflessness, which is the one that we did this year. But then progressively, one has to be able to understand also how the mind-only school speaks of selflessness, and then how the Madhyamaka, or the middle way school, also presents selflessness. And so what then becomes essential is to have an understanding of the two truths as they're presented according to the various schools, making it progressively subtler and more refined to get a complete and final understanding of selflessness, which is how the Madhyamaka school speaks of it. And technically, that is something that we should have done this year, because it is relevant or is connected with what we had studied this year, which is the methods or the path required to attain liberation.
소자 제마 람도 총바이나 ngazu tanda Serkong Institute Buddhist Study ni lo gangzang sumgi da labda nangshin cheje dos lobjen che ngazu chashi ji nyaman ting yore da di chashi di lamlong chongba이나 아니 lo khorma ngazu di kandar 대신 미다스 주르던 제외 디기 토네 아니 바게 다음에 고가 참고 디기 파르게 단다 세만남되기 리니베 대다 우미슝니부디 로 니베기 롭생 강산나로 가지고 야심보신 따야기 처시든지요.
So if everything goes to plan, then the aim of the Serkong Institute of Buddhist Studies eventually would be able to set up a 3-year structure or a 3-year format where the main subject matter for the second year would be the second chapter of the Pramanavartika, accompanied with an understanding of selflessness by taking it from a coarser understanding and taking it to the subtlest one. So then the entire content of the second year would be the second chapter of the Pramanavartika and Madhyamaka, because then it would be a complete presentation of liberation and the path required to attain liberation. So if everything goes according to plan, which is how we'd initially envisioned it, then that's how we would do the second year.
다단다 투즈 통도모도 마총바 연도 아니 간주 달로 리우니바 대시고듯이 로제모 우마도시 카가체리 김제도 수르와 투즈마다 얘기.
But because of a time constraint right now, and with the time that was possible to do this in, because it was not possible to do both of these together, is why we have separated them as two different subjects that are done in the second year and in the third year.
Tene namde liu tangbo nanglola zo ane tayang da sumi namsha zo di sungi yawa yende di lorim thangbo gi lobse nang la tu gre lorim thangbo rilam jang gi lobse thi nang la to she gre.
In the first chapter of the Pramanavartika, there are various things that are discussed. Of them, the presentation of correct signs, what makes a correct sign, and the three modes that lead to a correct sign, we have studied. We do that in the first year, where we do it in Tariq, because that's a necessary subject for one to learn how to reason and use reasoning in one study. So that part of the first chapter we do in the first year when we do Tariq.
Ta jamal labda soksona lo khorma nanglo la thangbo duda che teni tagri che dije la liu thangbo gi ani liu thangbo gi susum de je namsha di chasa dinala tuksta lobjong dinala.
So again, if and when there will be this 3-year version, in the first year there would be Duda, Tariq, and then all the sections from the first chapter that are relevant to understand Tariq and a presentation of the 3 modes required to make a correct sign, that part of the first chapter would be studied alongside Tariq.
Ta liu thangbo nanglo la jeja shense se jigda xingzing tokwa se gi jeje jig yor.
Then in the first chapter there's these 2 other topics that are extremely important, that I think in English would be translated like other eliminators, and in English it would be like a conceptual mind that is conceiving of a tree. It's kind of called like that. But basically it's a discussion of what other eliminators are and how conceptual minds engage in their objects. And so then there are these 2 subjects that are also extremely important in the first chapter.
Dayu.
And Dayul, which is known as the object of words or signs. So what is it that signs refer to is another topic that's done in the first chapter.
Di sumbodi ani dini dodebi lugi demani gi namshagi korda seu shede di sumdere joja.
Because these 3 are important, and they are also important in terms of being able to understand the Sautantrika presentation of the 2 truths, is why then these 3 topics from the first chapter we will do when we do the 3rd year, which is in relation to a presentation of the 2 truths according to all the schools, and these 3 will be discussed when we do the presentation of the 2 truths according to the Sautantrika school.
So zata umi shung di nubi ja yungdu an chedama lugi deni dodebi lugi deni semzambi lugi deni umabi lugi deni se ta dodebi lugi deni she yundi liu thangbu gi juja sumbodi ya tyenche ta kanda umi shung di che yundi khajin yama nga zo umi shung di ma tu yundi thangbu la tubda gi namsha ji tubda omani ye chibi demani gi namsha gi thonen thar ani umabi lugi ani tongni thama kan keje she ji ta lobsen lokhorme lobsen ala nga zo dig sha yor.
So in the way that we had envisioned doing it in that annual, in like a year-long program, was to be able to study tenets before studying Madhyamaka. And the way that we were planning on doing tenets, the various philosophical schools, was to do a presentation of the 2 truths according to the Vaibhashika, Sautantrika, Chittamatra, and Madhyamaka school. And these 3 subjects in the first chapter, we had taken them out. We wanted to take them out and study them or explain them when we do the presentation of the 2 truths according to the Sautantrika school, and then gradually build to study Madhyamaka later as kind of like a beginning or an introduction to studying actual Madhyamaka. So that's how we had envisioned it in that year-long program.
Ta in lojema mazu daani chega madu meba yindi di sazan ro thugu yona mena ta thesum ro resha.
But again, because next year the time that we have available is not that long, whether we'll be able to go into it in this entire, like in this way completely, is again something that we have to see.
Oh, dire. Ta di mazu shung jango yagi ta di shung yibodi reswa chemanamde gi liwin yibodi chikche ani chemanamde gi liwin yibe shung dishe chemanamde gi liu thangbo shung dishe tene umabi shung dishe ta semzambe gi demani gi namsha da sharama demani gi namsha ngomba zoya da ngomba kongma gi shung ne tu su tube yina dosin chimba yina tarbin namsha da dribe lamcha sangwa jela tösam che chung bari.
Which is why the texts that are kind of indispensable for one to study are the 2nd chapter of the Pramanavartika and the 1st chapter. And to be able to study these texts of the 1st chapter,
라. 단도 제만함들 리우 당고체, 리우 니베체, 단다디 우마숑디체. 아니 ngomba kundu semzamba charama dingi chutensana.
So the text so the first chapter and the second chapter, and along with this first chapter, then also Madhyamaka, that becomes kind of the core material required to be able to understand what the path that leads to liberation and within definitive goodness to liberation is. And in this, to understand the Vaibhashika presentation and the Chitta Matra, or the mind-only presentation, then bringing in certain aspects from the lower Abhidharma tradition for the Vaibhashika view and the higher Abhidharma tradition for the Yogacara or the mind-only view, then become the texts that are relevant or connected, concerned with the presentation of how to attain liberation.
다 단기 rillam 장사회 jel다 랑도르기 네데미 슝로 장고레스 다 슝딜라 녜레 타르발레 삼비 최 장고디 오다디 딘디직 땅아조 마타임 장고 타르바둥이 지금 마타임 딘디지 장고고였다.
So in this order that we've been saying, which is first one needs to learn how to reason, and then once one has reasoned, the texts that we study are to first learn the path, what is to be abandoned, what is to be adopted in connection to definitive goodness. And within definitive goodness, there is liberation and Buddhahood. In connection to liberation, the minimum understanding that one should have, and therefore the minimum amount of texts, material that one should study, is this, to get a good idea of what exactly the path is that leads to liberation.
다 딘디기 슝딜라 장체 아니 탈람 세부 젠네 라테데야 탈람 세디 칸디지 이메 세부 젠네 아니 오트딩에 아니 디귤 당보 탈람 디귤 기수 칸디 이메 디니 람디 콤비 디부 투수 칸디 이메 차 상와지 칸다르 나도 sabdada masono be 탈레미 로라 샤라 요바치 칸사지다 퇴바치네 딘디지 소고고요다.
So the result of studying, or the result of listening to teachings of this kind, not teachings but texts on this kind, or this material, the purpose of studying it and the purpose of listening to it is to have a very clear idea, kind of like a map, to have a very clear idea in one's mind of the map that is required for, which is understanding what exactly the path is, understanding how to move along this path, and understanding the result that one attains when one engages in this path. So an idea of what it is, how to proceed along it, and the result that one attains through it should be something that becomes absolutely clear, and one can immediately bring all of this to mind after having engaged in this initial phase of study. That's extremely important. That is what one kind of has to ensure that is happening when one listens to these teachings.
다 퇴삼기 qabla 다 디거지 소고에 nengaare 가르칠라나 디젤라 다 디젤라 곰바 조시네 로용도 게데 지기 로숨 딘데파 투저 땅체 참라 담체 리지트시에 타르바 탈람 두기스 라바이나 데링라 곰바 조시네 침바이나 디네갈 곰베 갑도데 라둘레 용도 람 마누르와 람기 고사메바 상마 소소랑게다 디디 소소치라 슝다 땡땡에다 디디케 모고바 소소게 랑기바 람기 고사도 마축바치제 따다 소소게 소토에지 곰베칼라 소토에지 퇴섬기 qabla 때나 바베데 오디스다.
The reason why this has to be absolutely clear at the phase of study and or hearing and reflection is because then, after having finished the study and reflection phase, when one then wants to take time out to meditate or to cultivate a meditative practice to actually attain this result, and therefore one might go to retreat or one might devote oneself to meditation, when one is sitting down to meditate, one has to be absolutely certain that the path that they are following and the practices that they're cultivating are not inaccurate or they are not incomplete. And at that point, one should also be able to be self-sufficient in this understanding and in cultivating the practice without then having to keep relying on texts or having to listen to other people explaining this again and again. And one should have a clear idea of what to meditate on, the order in which to do it, to ensure that one can actually make that progress when one is engaging in meditation. And to be able to have that, a clear understanding and a complete understanding, is cultivated at the time of study and reflection, so that in the meditative phase later, this is easy and one is able to do it by oneself.
셰 태삼기 갑을 냉가든지 사상하고 중마중보이나 안자마 공부 조우시 신윤도 두세 강성 소매 갑라 안 태좀게 해야 되는데 중보이나 다디 칸데연도 다디 인사말에 디 노리에 살살되니 신이 고사추 된대지 되는 신보이나 야면나야 탈람군을 로마토버지 고사 친주로 친야 소소이 고마트되는 신보이나 두주 촐라도야 야 수수기 태솜사에 고조보이나 수도도야
And again, why this is important before cultivating a meditative practice is because if this is not being done and then one engages in meditation, while one is meditating, at some point one will start to see this kind of doubt emerge about whether this is actually true, whether this is accurate, whether this is necessary, whether this is needed. And in lacking certainty about certain things that are fundamental, one may leave them aside and therefore cultivate an incorrect path or a wrong path. Or generating, and by doing that, cultivating wrong paths, one ends up wasting a lot of time. Otherwise, what also can happen is that one has doubt whether this is accurate or whether this is even efficient or not. And then this doubt can lead to giving up one's meditative practice and then exiting that path of meditation entirely. And so to prevent these two problems from arising when one is focused single-pointedly on cultivating a meditative practice, this should have already been clarified and understood earlier.
Teresha, the induta, Tesamji Kabla, Dodoje, Gobadi, Gombaji Kabla, Tizomi Yashi, Lamla. Gomba Kabla, Lala, Tizomi Yachi, Shada, Yadroya, Yuji.
Which is why at the time of hearing and reflection, the purpose of realizing what one is studying and therefore gaining certainty with what one is studying is to be able to eliminate doubt that could arise at the time of meditation. And when one has eliminated that doubt prior to engaging in meditation, then one ensures that one's practice, when one is cultivating a meditative practice, that goes unhindered and it can cultivate and grow without anything that prevents it from growing.
Kede, Pesha, what Kede. 투저릉부 지당저 공부가 투저릉부 지당저 간zam진 아우 겨왕아시 요살 아이나 세 도고께 가시는 가르치서.
For instance, what would you do if you spend a whole lot of time trying to cultivate a meditative practice and after many years you suddenly have a doubt and say, wait a minute, what if there is no rebirth? What would you do at that point?
So that dimyo와디 당분을 써요 그때.
So to be able to ensure that such problems don't arise later, before one engages in such practices, one should already have removed doubt.
손상 겨왕아시 여다 메 타르바 여다 메 셈나로 쇼르 메나 공부를 도사 메르다. 로가치나 단다 딜리기르티.
Which is why if one is not sure or certain or one has not removed doubt with respect to whether there is rebirth or not and whether liberation is even possible, then these kind of problems arise later when one engages in meditation or cultivating that in meditation.
다양하죠. 여담에 태좀더 레디네 최다신 로쇼그로 왔을라나.
We might feel that okay, fine, we might not have removed doubt, but why don't we kind of just assume that it's there in this kind of hit and trial method, see if it works out. That could be one way of trying. And then so you kind of say, you feel, oh well, I'll try it out, and if it doesn't work, so what? Doesn't really matter, I'll come back. If you have 200 years to live and try this, then that's great, then it's fine, you can test it like that. So if it was certain that one dies only at the very end, and that very end was at the end of 200 years, then one has this kind of time to toy around with these different ideas and test them out one by one. But we don't have that kind of. Which is why, because we don't have this luxury or this certainty, right from the beginning at the very onset, one has to ensure that one can try and gain complete certainty about what one is setting out to do.
당다디 타르바드 디베 남샤 샤소와 다디 지구직상 시제 아니 탐지신비 고반 토벌 되나 대단 디베 남샤디 단단하신 신 쪼고리.
And much like the path that is required to be understood with complete certainty that leads to liberation, afterwards, the same attitude or the same way of proceeding is also required with the path that leads to complete Buddhahood.
디인도다 탐지심바도 드베 남기 남샤디 아니 가주 로름 숨바기다 로세나라 샤요. 지당기 로숨기 나니 로숨비 로세나라 샤요.
Which is why in the 3-year format where it is a complete year, the part that deals with the stages and the path and the what is to be abandoned and what is to be cultivated with the objective of attaining Buddhahood, we have put that in the 3rd year. So who's going to come and do this? Who would kind of approach such a study would probably be someone who's interested in studying the Dharma. So someone who then is interested in understanding the Dharma, they should be ideally someone, or they would be ideally someone who has some inkling for liberation, or at least as a kind of foundation, they would have an idea of liberation and wish for liberation if they're interested in studying the Dharma.
양면나 단다 딘디기 대방문주 개매바 있나야 간다 tarbe sabienda tarbegi sabian soroji yebe soroji dindiji yebe soroji tonang dusle edel jawaji yorda.
Even if they don't have this kind of manifest interest, if you consider the fact that someone who might not have this manifest wish for liberation, the kind of people who end up coming to this kind of study or approach this world will be someone who has some sort of seed for attaining liberation, even if they might not have this kind of manifest wish to attain it.
가르질라는 게 무엇인지 되게 직니지라 이디케 첨부 쉬우저 디케라 마타에 마딜로준 치하고레스 세제 가주 우주견을 레통민도 될로지가.
Why I'm saying this, that there will be some sort of seed, some latent seed in them, is because I have a lot of other people who I have told, or I have kind of introduced what we're doing here, and I have said, if you really want to understand, this minimum kind of study or understanding you should have. But despite however many times I've tried to kind of show the importance of this to them, they have never made it here. They haven't come.
디인도의 넘버서 레어선 마세 달로 두지 땅시에 디시인데 땡땡데니 사변지도 요 땡땡데 요 랍통에 도시래.
To those of you who've actually now been here for the entire 2.5 months, have taken time out and devoted it to be here and spend your 2.5 months in the way that you have, the fact that you made it here does suggest that a little bit of this seed, if not manifest desire, must be there.
Oh, then 다 디인데 로제메 다데 가조 로다 단다 다원이 제가 디인데 로제메 제마들 봐. 디갑라 아니 가조 탐지셔버 로비 유 탐지셔버 톱지 규 조지 되니 디규 자와체 되니 탐지셔버 고번 주베 탑스 다 디숨다 제베 남샤디 가조다 로타마델 리그셰.
So for those of us who are here in this 2.5 month format, the presentation of the path to attain Buddhahood with what is the cause, what is the root of that cause, and what is the path that leads to that result is what we're going to be doing in the 4th year in connection to Buddhahood.
땅 개대 가조 로컬마 진도 소에 제마 중거이나 아니 슝다우디 조응원도 genre gen namni 있어지 조응원도 gen체 되게 가공기 연라들로 도디긴이 nen가듯이 아니 장사듯이 다 태고 준비 슝딱 가조 조 디솜부디 자지 다슝 로컬마 로전 셰지 가조 로전지 디에 디초고래 다 디에 차시 요래 따이네야 단다 다원이 시간에 디가 딘주 용도고 말해 디인도양 고 다원이 시간에 차고 있으면 육류주 nen가 고고 여배인데 가가실리.
So in the eventual 3-year format, the 3rd year, which is now dealing with the texts that are relevant to understand how to attain Buddhahood, the ones that we had in mind, they're known as the 2 ornaments, which is the ornament of realizations and the ornament of Mahayana Sutras. And then there's a 3rd text known as the stages of Bodhisattvas, Bodhisattva Bhumi. So these 3 texts will be the main texts that we'll try and bring together, or that's kind of the plan of combining these 3 texts to be able to have a complete understanding of what the stages are or what the path is to attain Buddhahood. But in the 2.5-month format, because it is only 2.5 months, being able to cover all of these 3 texts is unlikely.
어든지샤. 다 덴데기 다 슝강라 장고의 슝디르다. 온도도 녀레기 좀 슝딘조 가지고 로전 제거 디르. 디인도 단단 가지고 롭센도 스틱샤바디. 다디 디케란조가 단다 디 장샤바디 땅 가지고 사변소라고 그랬다.
So these are the texts that one has to study, that one should know if one wants to have a clear understanding of the path that leads to definitive goodness. And so these are kind of the texts that we're also trying to, so even though we can't go through all these texts, but the content of these texts is what we're trying to do in the way that we've structured the classes here and the course over here. Which one? Bodhisattva Bhumi, stages of Bodhisattva. No, that's the 3rd.
Oh yeah. 다 딘데기 슝디 롭종체용데 베나 달로기 롭선소로 기란조 롭종체버와 디인데 다 파조체 두절 항마갑로 수수기 랑종체거와 슝장윤데 슝디 건네 양경주 로드갈라 치기 모동지구 삼마땅 마데버체제 슝지고소 슝기 강장기 고와 로로 추부스웨디 개청부요.
So now when you'll be gone, when you'll go away from here, because you have all this time off, you have all this free time in between, when you will be revising it, please try not to kind of, when you're revising it or going through it, just get stuck on the words and trying to understand solely the words and a presentation of the words, but try and see if everything that you have studied, that we have studied, you can actually try and connect it to your own experience.
디인데다 슝카디 슝춤부도 마도 스타인데 나렌다 나가모 야가 케베스 나렌다 나로라 슝롭좀 제유데 슝기 고와 차상 렌라 가르치기 요래 예왕아지 체요래 슝마 셰바 이나래 소소기 녜베 갑라 이나래 tö바체베 갑라 이나래 파 셰베 갑라 이나라 가리 요래설나 참저를 세지 슝의 집바루라 참저를 세지 고 데메 마이바 고 참저단 슝기 참저를 nen가직다 이거지.
So in India, when in Nalanda they used to study, or the tradition that was kind of passed down, so there's generally 5 kind of aspects that they deem very important when one is studying texts. And the first one of these aspects is being able to connect texts with each other. Because otherwise what ends up happening is things stay kind of unrelated, and when one is studying, one is not able to connect very well different sections and different texts together. So the first of these 5 criteria that are essential, or they deemed essential to when they were studying texts, was to ensure that they could connect the dots or connect of the various sections and the various texts with each other. Then after being able to connect the texts, the other thing that was essential was to understand the meaning of the words individually of the text. And then being able to summarize. So after having studied individually all the different words and connecting the various sections of the text, being able to summarize whatever they had studied was also considered extremely important. And then another section that was very important was addressing objections. So after having studied, bringing up various doubts and objections that one may face in what one is understood, and being able to answer or being able to provide replies to the various objections that come up. Good. And then also kind of the purpose of doing this entire thing. So the general purpose of studying in this text, or studying these texts, these 5 aspects were always deemed essential when they engaged in any kind of study.
그래서 디 인데 다 달로기 슝서로 두 스마로전 시기나 왜나 또 슝리레기 시드니어와 시드니도 스마 로제 시드니다도 삼로코에 직체 다 지금마 레인도 간라 아니 가마가마 치마치마도 레르도 첨자접에서도 막 연바치자 같이도 3주도 또 3주 jorgu도 세 3주디 하고 와체.
So when you go through the text again, when you read it, of course one has to ensure that individually one understands all the different verses, all the meaning of the individual words while one is reading the text. And so that's the first attempt. But after one has read and one has understood the meaning of all the individual verses, also to ensure that they don't seem like they're jumping from one section to another or the things are unconnected with each other, try and also make in your own mind a connection between all the things that you're reading. So there's a flow to it and they all connect into one coherent or one kind of consistent line of reasoning.
드니 두두 다 3주 주행인데 아니 지게부 여대바 디기 계시망고 여대바 디기 닝부 된다 수 뒤는 독도수야 고하게라 두두 디페지체.
And then if you can do this, then also to make sure that you have like a takeaway or you have some sort of understanding that is tangible, try and summarize everything that you are reading and thinking about. All the individual words, and when you connect them, then try and make a summary or summarize whatever you are thinking about so that you have like a kind of a takeaway from this entire thing. You have some sort of concrete idea of what you're discussing and what you're thinking about.
다 덴데기 qabla 아니 로도 깨베이나 도발레베이나 디 겔렌 딱딱 마 장마소트야.
Then when you've done this and you have now some understanding, then at that point see if you have any doubts concerning the various things that you have understood that are being explained in the text. And then when you start to see whether there are any doubts or there are any objections that you might find with your understanding, then make sure that you can use your reasoning to address each one of these doubts and all of these various objections that you might start to see that develop in one's own mind while one is trying to understand the text.
다 덴데기 슝강자라 도스체베 그전 가르래. 어디 그전이.
And then at the end, after you can do all of this, don't lose sight of the purpose of this entire exercise or this entire endeavor. And so also keep in mind the final purpose of studying a text like this, why you're doing it.
다디 슝쇼몰라 퇴바 퇴섬 수신도 제당디 띠르다.
So this is the correct way to study the Shastras or the texts.
다디 나렌데기 투무마이미 도마르디.
This is like a unique way or like a very kind of, it's a unique way that was used when people in Nalanda were studying texts.
어디래? 디인도다 퇴바 체인도 퇴바 최 꿀롱 당봉을 퇴바 최 용도 퇴바 최 꿀롱 가래래. 디니 퇴섬 제용도 지룩 제당 단다디나시. 딘디진 침부이나 안 퇴바기 꿀롱디 뭐주바. 퇴섬 제당디 있고 추신도 제바 유베 인도 아니 디기 편 따숑니 셰바나시 따다 용구요다.
So when you set out or you'll embark on listening to the teachings or reflecting on the teachings, try and ensure that the motivation behind why you're doing it is clear. And then when you're doing it, when you're actually engaging in study and reflection, try and make sure that the way you're going about doing it is also accurate. Because in this way, you can ensure that the motivation is not misguided, which will then ensure that when you're engaging in the text, you've engaged in it for all the right reasons, engaged in study and reflection. And then while you're actively doing it, you also ensure that you're doing it completely without losing sight of any different aspect. So please make sure that when you do or engage in study and reflection, your intention is clear for why you're doing it. And then when you're doing it, when you're actually engaging in that action, to ensure that you do it completely.
다 딘디 니부 디강라 라마 공원 속에 넘바 가시식 교열 개전부 가시식 가리 교열스나 라마지기 단덴데 송열 슝기 나로라 단다 제공단 주미기 숭지 나올데 송열에 데네 깔레슈 잡제다 배트코는 두리 쇼 제제 아니 슝이야 망보 쇼 제제 냐와 망보 참 두리지 잡데바 덴데지 구지기 아니 디용고 말했어. 퇴바치베 그 편 사주셔보더니 용토에 하고 그랬어. 디인데 아니 냠도 초고 유소든도 차상 창원체는 야구요래. 그래서 공들이 수 납제지.
So then, when these two kind of main aspects, one ensures that one is able to bear them in mind and proceed in this manner, then the masters from the past, they have added certain other criteria to ensure that the benefits of engaging in such study and reflection will actually arise. And so, Jik Hontan Tempe Drome, he in his text, he has said that if one exerts in study and reflection in this manner, and one really kind of presses on and really persists with it and brings it to an end, it's not guaranteed that just this kind of perseverance in this manner and bringing to completion this task is necessarily going to give rise to all the benefits that study and reflection has. Along with this kind of perseverance of carrying on with the studies, there are certain other conditions that need to be met to ensure that the benefits or the corresponding benefits are actually attained.
와이. 소소 공기들이 손여래. 셰럽 전부 여버제. 아니 슝라 깔리슈 yaptı tösomçel 깔리슈 yaptın tö바싱el tö바슈엘 깔리슈 yaptın 예직 두주슈 땅에 제샤바 디니 삼시기 딱 고추민도 우송 공개.
So Khondan Tempe Drome, he said, being kind of very intelligent and being really smart and studying and then making great effort in study and reflection, if one has these two are not sufficient or enough to give rise to the benefits that are actually supposed to be attained by engaging in study and reflection.
다 가르쳐 오래했어요. 이거라 아니 당부될라. 되니 퇴바 최용도 퇴바 최신도 땡킹이 신이지 인지 민지 된 거래. 최고래했어.
So he's added to these two that before one engages in study and reflection, being able to find a teacher or a guide who can actually lead us, or an accurate, like an adequate guide, finding someone from whom one can listen and receive teachings is essential.
가르치는 라바이나 단다 대시에디에게 단단간도 다다 디마 쳐다비랑 가서 직 시에디에시도 봐. 소소 셔럽 전부 요바이나 도 소소 롭존 셴데 셴바이나 치기 모도마도 치디기 무수 땐데 치기 모동이 된다데 마도 치디기 갑로로 된다 가리가리 매디요미디 고토고 말해.
The reason
신이는 마데나.
The reason why he says one has to rely on a spiritual guide is because even if one is very intelligent and very learned and one's kind of intellectual abilities are very heightened, when one studies by oneself without relying on a guide, the meaning of the words, the immediate meaning of the words may be apparent and clear, but the underlying meaning, or like a deeper meaning that lies behind just a very explicit understanding of the words, is going to not be accessible unless you rely on someone who's passing that on to you.
아니 니버디 düdü 슝이 고와 창마 dü니 똑똑 쇠저와 디신이는 마데모 용 카고래.
And then without relying on a spiritual guide, he says also, being able to summarize or condense the meaning of what one has learned to have like a real summary of everything that then what remains with one, that also is difficult to attain or impossible to attain unless there is someone who's guiding us in our study and reflection. So if you're smart and you're intelligent, a little bit of ability to debate on the words and be able to answer to certain objections and defend positions, that might be able to happen. A little bit of that's possible. But another thing that gets lost is being able to connect the texts. And not just being able to connect the texts become difficult, but the most important one is the purpose, the entire purpose of why one even studies the text, that gets totally lost.
근데 낭주가 직 시에서 디가는 직 우마가는 시에서 파진가는 시에서 shiu share the sig dwa dinga di keje chidu gala knowledge the halamasun zero double to do tende lamge chongso.
So I personally haven't seen such people, but I've been told that there are professors of Buddhist studies in universities who are kind of professors with tenure, so they're very well established and they're also authorities in their field. And if you ask them to teach about Madhyamaka, they'll be able to give a whole presentation. If you ask them to teach about Abhisamaya, they can do that. If you ask them to teach about Pramana, they can do that as well. But then when you inquire and you ask about these 5 aspects of studying, which we've just discussed, then suddenly it seems like whatever learning they have or whatever understanding they possess, it absolutely evaporates in the face of trying to contextualize it in this manner, according to these 5 criteria that were fundamental in the way it was passed down in Nalanda. And so suddenly, these very learned professors, I have been told, they seem to not really live up to the mark, if at all, when it comes to this way of approaching and studying texts.
So that 콘도 태바 자천부 마치나 프로페서 차요 말와 로존 자천부 제요와 이네다 가리 미싱 차도스나 딘데기 셰다비 랑가기 nen가다 데니 땡킹기 신이직 다다지 마충바 인디 아니 고된데 라디도.
So for them to be able to reach that level of understanding and knowledge, they would have definitely engaged in extensive hearing and reflection. But where they are lacking would be in not having ensured that these 5 ways or these 5 aspects, they're called like the 5 limbs that are required to be able to hear and reflect on the texts. They have not been able to fulfill these because they have not relied on someone to explain it to them. And so not having relied on a spiritual guide or a teacher to explain this to them, the purpose of why they've engaged in this exercise is lost.
Oh yeah, that the indu kongi shamba ju changwe kechum jigdi wada dendegi twesam chu gazo shungjengi tanda chedangdi chu shindu chetungi gebishinyi dengwe tangbo de she. Da nibe de kari songresno chudungi chodi songshi.
Then so he's said amongst being able to be intelligent and being kind of persevering, the other condition that he said was relying on a guide. The other one that he has mentioned that is a necessary condition is to have kind of a community of friends who are like-minded in their pursuits.
So chudungi chodi be kechum songre. So chudungi chol tenche ta ko gegendegi ko 추티가로 개인 두지 당시 시기래도 두지 망쳐와디 초로냠도 깨고 여바인데 아니 초로든 쪽에 냠도 아니 롤링 재난대야 고 직직보관 좀 되어지 직이 된다 잡로 거와 당기나신 슝규지 거와 뒤뒤에 되도간도 초로냠도 두지 깨세 팔로게데 줄로게데 된데기 차네 초로디 개좀 부시고 차기요 뒤인데 규진이버디 추딩 조상부 때는 이버에 셔.
The reason why I think they're called like Dharma friends. The reason why that is so important is because with one's teacher, one has a limited amount of interaction, which is when they're teaching. Because the majority of one's time is spent within a community surrounded by one's Dharma friends, if they are not concerned with the same thing, or they are concerned only with kind of having a understanding of the words and not really delving more into how to connect them or make them relevant, then that's not really a sustainable way to carry forward. Therefore, having a community or having Dharma friends surround one who have the same interest or same pursuit and they want to proceed in a similar manner then becomes a necessary condition to be able to ensure that one receives the benefit of one's efforts. And then so this was the second condition that he adds on to the first 2. And then the third condition which he speaks of is purification and accumulation of merit.
gyurungmu di keruwa tuzu di rejikan lo nishu sangas di keyu ngarangi tongshu nanglo la di tongyo di indi ko tsosa dibjang shu yagu che dinge dinzo kadu de la jigbo shu yagu me shu zoba ke meba yina rimgi jama ko ya minda waji tönyo di ko musum soro wajresha 다 당보 지나는 소인도 아띠 리고 야갈 디다 쉬우 용사리 삼산라고 질지마 강리 교르 로데 통쇼를 중고도 소사 디비전시라 더 제와 메딩에 도
If one doesn't engage in too much of this accumulating merit, so if one doesn't have this support of merit, irrespective of how bright or smart or intelligent or how kind of skilled they may be in their ability to reason, without this support of merit or without trying to purify one's negativities, in the 20 years, or 20 odd years that I have kind of been involved in this world, you see that people who initially you didn't have great expectations from, or who were not necessarily like stand out in terms of their ability or their mental prowess, over the years, just staying at it but constantly engaging in trying to accumulate more merit and purify one's negativities, you see over time that they get progressively better and deeper in their understanding. It also works on the other way, where people who in the beginning were like incredible and you really had high expectations because you saw that they had this incredible ability to understand and extreme clarity with how they think, but they kind of never developed, or they were very unconcerned with trying to accumulate merit or trying to purify their negativities. Over the years, you suddenly see that they're not making any progress, and then it actually starts declining whatever abilities they had, and they get progressively worse. This is something that I myself have seen. It's kind of like it's almost like it's a manifest phenomenon. You can ascertain or see that it works like that.
손자 라마 고마 쪼기 소사 디비전 디 귤레 송번나시 디 이체 투에지레시다 김정거는 시럽고에 메댕하다 이체 투에레샤.
So because the masters of the past have always insisted on purification and accumulation of merit as a necessary condition to sustain and ensure that things don't fall off track, even though there's not a lot of reasoning that you can provide to show why it's essential, when you kind of observe the way people are and how they progress along the way, you can kind of see that this is undeniably essential, even though you may not be able to give kind of great reasons to support why it is like that.
다 게란솔라 디 가르소래 니시게에셔도 라고르다 칭이라서 당고야 주주로는 셰인데 나 지나나를 지고 야가테게 말해.
So I'm telling you this to get a little more convinced of this point. And so when I joined the Institute of Buddhist Dialectics, I wasn't amongst those who were the brightest in the class.
The ding some meno.
Must have been I wasn't one of the dull ones either. I was kind of in the middle at some point.
아, 네. 소저지보야고 효들이 진단나로라.
I had certain classmates who were incredibly sharp.
다이네 ngaran탄데 뽑아돈 라트웨디 카르라도들라나 로존데 제비 갑도들라 소사리존을 슈가로 야였다.
But what I can say with some amount of confidence is, while I studied, I really made an effort in accumulating merit and purification.
다 디기 제마야 진짜 야레윤데 리보야고 용인 보고든서 단다시제 아니 고아이나 가리나 단다시제 라베 셰라에디 파지 디기 균진들이 지금 돈 땡땡 레샤세지 소소셈나리 소화되는 시들이시도.
So then, despite not being the brighter amongst the brightest in the class, after many years being able to have an understanding of the texts, or be able to understand them in a way which was at par with their way of understanding it, if I look at how that could have happened, even though I might not have been amongst the brightest, I tie it down to having made such an effort in purification and accumulating merit.
Oh yeah. 다양디 다샤죠. 어디 오늘 딘데 용초해지래샤. 어디인데 소사집전에 계신 보신 소인 금지되래.
This is why accumulation of merit and purification is always being spoken of by everyone as an essential feature to ensure that all the conditions are met, are complete.
다 디낭로라 개천부직 셰여래. 얘네 디 망부직 제도고 말해. 그래서 결혼도 나로 제통의 연항이 유디 랍셔야래. 가르스라나 랑기 라마 대다 랑 최딩이 라마 대다 아니 수수에게 학비 클라식 잠배 양소라고 이담 가리는 이담 수수 칸라 매바에 대해서 학비 하주직 데리직라 담셰 대동고 이름에도 대시 아니 소와다베티 따디 흉망분하는 송요래 이네 디 창맥이 제도에 말해.
There's another kind of requisite or cause that is often spoken of, not often actually, it's always mentioned in all the texts, but it's not something that everyone can do. So if you find that you can do this, then I'll say it, but it's not, everyone is not able to easily do this. And what's mentioned in the texts as another condition that is essential to ensure that one's study and reflection goes in the right direction and gives the appropriate results is being able to conceive of or being able to envision one's guru and whatever deity one is cultivating as inseparable and then request blessings from them. And so supplicating them as inseparable and requesting blessings from them has been mentioned again and again in all texts as an essential quality that's needed to be able to progress accurately in one's study and reflection. But it's not something that everyone can do. And so if you can do it, that's great. If you, yeah.
그래서 맞아 진짜 소용이 쇼게 셔도 고 당부 소용인데 라마도 공부 지진 장배양을 찾아서 가서 디 교육이 와. 어디 가르쳐서나 랑기 라마 대다 랑라 최대이 라마 대다 지진 장배양 오 예매드신 소와다비 계절로 왔다.
In the morning when we recite that homage, which is I go for, how is it? What's the opening line in English? No, the Manjushri one. What is? So it says homage to my Lama and protector Manjushri. That's exactly what's being said. The Lama and Manjushri are seen as inseparable, and then you supplicate them.
디시디 라마 대샤 장배양 대샤는 라마 당 지진 두 삼다에 말해. 라마 대가는 지진 장배양 걸 대시 소와다.
So when you're doing this, when you're doing the supplication, you're not seeing the Lama here and Manjushri on the other side, and you're supplicating them as two separate things. You're seeing the Lama itself as Manjushri, and then you're supplicating.
다디 나가면 야갈라 디르숑디다 야갈로 드네 삼로당난디 강해요 말에 맞아 별로 최 상념만이 다르되어 있는데 디 삼로당을 강해요 말에 따이네요 웨스턴 룽발고 나주 사와 다르게 여디 디테스 강해요 삼로당이 디 람루 디 매바 있는데 딘데기 강해지 체디게요 니주 고야도.
Because what this aspect especially is something that came out of India and then it spread to Tibet, where culturally this was very acceptable and it was very normal. People never found it particularly difficult to do this because culturally it was very natural. Whereas now when the Dharma is spreading to Western countries where this is not cultural, it's not a cultural norm or it's not culturally present, it's not something that you hear of from a very young age, there is a little bit of difficulty. I've heard that it is a little difficult for Westerners to do this because it's not part of kind of their upbringing. Which is why I'm not going to say that you have to do this. This is essential for all of you to do. If you can, good. If you can't, then leave it. But those who do this, we see that there is enormous benefit to those who are able to do this.
지rum부시 우미슈나 로종슈 제제 고랑게 따위 고와지 샤제드네야 제라 고랑게 라마 규지 지진 잠배양라 컨디슈인데 지진 잠배양 한다 계란 따오콜이야 고멘도스.
When Lama Tsong Khapa, when he engaged in extensive study and he came to a point where he had some understanding of the middle way view or of Madhyamaka, then when kind of through a medium of another Lama, he inquired whether his view was accurate. He inquired and he asked Manjushri if his view was accurate. His understanding was accurate. Manjushri said, your understanding of Madhyamaka is not there yet.
아니 딱 가르랬어요. 컨디션인데 지진 잠배 양기 냉각하시지 소.
And then when Lama Tsongkhapa asked and he said, what is it, like what's lacking? Then in response to what was lacking, Manjushri gave a few answers.
되네 마 냉각하시지 마송인데 아니 저름지 따디가 다나 고구민도스. 디고 걔랑 냉각송거디 고통민도스 야슈르.
So then when Manjushri was giving explanations of the middle of the Madhyamaka view, Lama Tsongkhapa told Manjushri, he said, what your explanations, your clarifications, I don't understand them, I can't understand what you're saying.
간조 까브레디 팅기다 잠배양로 시에스니 송나라서 고글 섬기도 고글 말다.
We often feel, no, that if Manjushri came down and started speaking to us, we'd understand. Lama Tsongkhapa didn't understand.
디시든 간조 레오 많이 안 돼.
So don't have this expectation to meet Manjushri.
그래서 딱 고구민도 딱 가르쳐 그랬어요. 아니 지진 잠배양기 저름지 랍지디 숨겨와 소사 디장치 아니 흉처모 양내양도다. 또 우미 흉도 양내양도다. 아니 소소기 라마다 하고서 좀 오예메도 제주 소왔답스. 디 규숨도 송시.
So when Lama Tsongkhapa told Manjushri that he was unable to understand his explanations of emptiness of the Madhyamaka view, then Manjushri told him to do three things. He said, first engage in purification and accumulation of merit, reflect and study the great texts, the great treatises again and again and again, and then supplicate the Lama and your deity as inseparable.
So 아니 저름지 디디 생년라 정보여 로마야 망보여도 로마 동송 망보를 비티 송주 나도 거로 디상마 샤제 차델페 소사 디비잖나 아니 라마다 학별 하죠 오예메도 진 소왔다 아니 흉충무데 데디시지 아니 동닉 다왔다 총시.
When this happened, Lama Tsongkhapa was already very famous and very renowned, and he had thousands of disciples, and he was teaching them regularly. He was surrounded by them. But when he was given this advice by Manjushri, he dropped all of that. He dropped all his activities and he went off into retreat. And in that, he engaged in extensive purification and accumulation of merit. And he fervently supplicated the Lama and his Lama and the deity again and again, seeing them as inseparable. And then, as a result of that, he attained the correct view.
So then 동익이 따와도 총사회 제라 공기 흉 된데도 발라서 흉을 제고 저와.
And after the view arose in his mind, he started to compose texts like the Praise to Dependent Origination and all of his writings on Madhyamaka.
어디 디인데 아니 지름부치 얘기더니 도저 둘레만 나로라 당보 야전토 망도 쌀 바도 흉노 담지 담바샤 아니 타만 인증군도 냠술로 군게 땜바게 비쳐도 오송시.
Tojo dilemma, do you know what it is in English? Tojo dilemma. In one of Lama Tsongkhapa, I don't know what the text is in English, but one of the verses is, having engaged in extensive hearing and then with extensive hearing and meditation, and then having engaged in cultivating a lot of merit and purification, through engaging in reflection and meditation, then the view arose in me. So the same order is valid for us, where first engage in extensive hearing. And then when Lama Tsongkhapa also says, how do you engage in extensive study or reflect in hearing? He says, don't have a biased attitude, don't have a partial attitude, but engage in it without these kind of, without these filters. So for instance, this year you just studied a little bit of one text, not being satisfied and content with just this. One has to go further, deeper into one's study and reflection. when one has done this, when one studies and reflects in this way, then what starts happening as a result of this is that the texts themselves start to appear like instructions. They start to become instructions.
담바샤르 세두 슝루기 냉가레레네 수수기 냠 귤레 자당 냠네 시단데 냉가디 시엔쿠리 담바샤르스는 데르다.
So they start to appear as instructions means that whatever the texts are saying start to appear as if they were instructions or indications of how one is to practice. And so they start clarifying and they start furthering one's own understanding and one's realizations, the words themselves.
손상 콩기 떡어줘버 디낭로라 아니 당보 퍼징기 슝 담바샤르다. 데니 장주 람기림바 담바샤르다. 데니 도데겐데 장사라 소버 담바샤르다. 데니 라바 군디도 도군디도 담바샤르다. 안 타마델라 상하기 규데 오마니 제가 nga 라미게 바게 슝르레네 담바샤르다 용조 송도가 담바데데데 샤송 담마라 샤송 세지.
So when Lama Tsongkhapa then writes in this praise, he says, first the Abhisamaya text, the text on the perfection of wisdom, they started to arise as instructions. Then the Lamrim's text started to arise as instructions. Then the text associated with the Abhidharma tradition started to arise as instructions. And then the Tantric text, starting from the lower Tantras all the way to the higher Tantras, all of these started to appear, or they started to appear and arise as instructions to Lama Tsongkhapa.
다 슝루 담바샤르 연두 아니 퇴섬 수준도 제발 때는 냠nen치다게 내 말류가 슝라 때도 소소라 샤르 연두 다 인생권도 타마델라 아니 인생권도 냠솔라스.
When this starts happening, then Lama Tsongkhapa writes, then day and night uninterruptedly I practiced in them. So after having gone through this, then unceasingly, unwaveringly, continuously, I engaged in cultivating or practicing this.
다 되는 냠nen치 연두 아니 소소 규처 똑바게 아니 소소라 가리가리 연구하다 섬기 미쳐 편 레용고 여러와 딜레 연두 다 된데데 아니 콘솔레 중로치나 콜라이 중로치나 콜라이 중로치나 세제 삼로디 다 레용고 투기 명람디 뜻 가르소거데 된데 투기를 총연데 아니 된데기 상계기 땜바디 다 초두꾼도 파 게제 미 상매기 줄을 디나지 똑같이 깨로치나 세게 아니 뭐와디 되기 여러 디인디 군제 땜바게비 쳐도 뭐세 딜레버스.
And then when one does this, when one is at that state, then gradually one's mind starts to get freed, or it starts to getting liberated from all of these constraints, and one's realizations, they grow increasingly. And as one starts to then have this constant benefit of one's mind getting progressively freer and more realized, then that wish that may others, when we see others, then that wish that they may also have such a state, may they also attain such a realization, may they also attain freedom from such a thing, naturally started developing. And so when that starts developing, then the wish for the teachings to remain and spread so that through these teachings everyone can have this benefit naturally came about. And so then that's when Lama Tsongkhapa said, and therefore may the teachings remain and may the teachings spread so that everyone can kind of savor this benefit from them.
So that Jerumbishi Korangi, da Korangi Namtarse or Kuzegi Namtasor Korang Susurangi Tokba Kandij Toko Jovas, Suzuki, Yundin Jovas, the Indi Korang Kuzinalo, Kulit di Jumba Yinchere. The Indi Ganzo Topachunchu Cheche, and the Karso Najish Dena, Zawin Digmare, the Indi Jajun Toba Mountains. And Pardo, Shundu Tamji Dambasha, Bejan Shawarma, Chorich, Kashijidus, Yamson and the Shembadi, she was sent from somebody, the Digmare, Shundu Tamji Dambasha. Tene Dawa Kashi, the Dunda Kashi, the Dindiji Gomche, and she would change the Yushan Digman, Taman Yungu, the Yamsulons, Digor. Tama de Ani, Sangi, Demba, Jerum Jokorang, 2 human German Shinche, Demba and Jinsho, Majava, Chabin, Yabajubi short, and Nijishim, Yerabjaba, Pendi did the several Chava shows, or the Merum German Nashinji Tony, Demba Gibichedo, Dindijita, Washini, Lagaji Chavina. 다 지름부시 디송들 수디송이 두마 랭네다 세다 데스타미인데 땡이 미세 된다든 베케샤스다 베트미세 하고 슈케샤 두저톨라 치민도서 코랑코랑 가와게제 수디송이 두마 랭네다 데디 융에디 수이까딩 된 총소지 라마샴베인 까딩 된 총화인데 까딩 치고 지진게 베트 디송도.
When Lama Tsongkhapa writes this, he's essentially, so this text is kind of citing Lama Tsongkhapa's realizations or his qualities. And when he says that this is what I did this in just this much time, and I attained this result, the advice that is giving us is, when we study, you can't be satisfied with kind of having very limited, short understandings of limited individual texts without having a complete idea, which is why Lama Tsongkhapa says in the beginning, engage in extensive reflection and study, not just partial. After that, when the texts start to arise as instructions, then don't be satisfied with some sort of realization or some quality that will suddenly come up in your mind and stay satisfied with that. All the texts have to arise as instructions, and that has to be a lot vaster than just being satisfied with small little hits of realizations or experiences that one has. And then after that happens, being content with spending a couple of weeks or a few months every now and then in cultivating the Dharma is also not sufficient, which is why the Lama Tsongkhapa says, and then I engaged unceasingly day and night in cultivating this. And so after having done all of this, the realizations and the benefits that I have had, all of this has been done. And then at the end, when Lama Tsongkhapa reflected and he said, what I have done in my life, I feel like I have no regret. And so he was satisfied, or he was kind of rejoicing in his own activities. In that vein, he then made an aspiration that may the teachings that have led to this, the teachings that the source of all of this well-being that I have attained, may they remain, may they spread endlessly on them throughout the planet to all beings, so that they may also have the same kind of realizations. And then at the end, because what enabled him to do this was the blessings of Manjushri, then he pays homage to Manjushri at the end. So that's how Lama Tsongkhapa kind of presents his entire life and how he went about doing it as an indication of how one can attain a similar result.
Da sanyi gandhi ngaju khedi gdwa di ende da sanyi ngaju yomarwa di ende jirumbuchege yende da namba da di nanda de sungshe jirumbu koranangi toju dulman sungshe yende di message reshti di yende di message reshti.
Tomorrow is Lama Tsongkhapa Day, right? And because we're not here together, when I'll find the name of the text and tell you, but this text where Lama Tsongkhapa is kind of mentioning his realizations or his qualities is a very it's a very good or a very complete text in being able to realize or recognize and remember, bring to mind Lama Tsongkhapa's qualities and Lama Tsongkhapa's life.
So the boru dhuzeradu ngi tyongorde chamsam dhuzeradu chajena tyonggo mara chamsam tyongorde so the di ya so so ningdup shutigido di simshushu bargidi.
So when I sometimes when I have time, I do read and recite this text. Not always, but whenever I do have time. But I've noticed that whenever I do kind of go through this text, it is, I don't know, it's very motivating, or it's kind of very it makes you feel very empowered or very motivated and enthusiastic to carry on. And then each time I read this, it kind of really inspires me or motivates me to read more or reflect more and understand and study more.
Oh yeah, 당가서 어디나 신시지 지루부시 남다지 팀이 토네. 안 소소의 디나 신시 제냠부이나 상인 간등감 주 찾드리지.
So if remembering and recollecting Lama Tsongkhapa's life and his qualities, if we also make an aspiration to be able to do or be able to live in a similar way and have a similar result, then we are doing today what we would be doing tomorrow because of Lama Tsongkhapa's day.
So the 가장은저 타마들 덴베 남다들 제네 계지 시행바도 시미기 부통나디. 딜라인데 잉득지도 가절 당가저 딘디시나 딘디 차에도 와서 디나시 단다디 도주들로만 도 슬로이네 소소의 디치엘디 남다디 디 슈진티도디.
So if you remember when we read towards the end of the text, the life of the Buddha from when he was Prince Siddhartha and the various activities he did, And as a result of what he did in his life, then the result that he attained, that was inspiring. It kind of motivates you to do the same. Similarly, if you read this text by Lama Tsongkhapa and you see what he did in his life, that also is very inspiring.
Oh yeah. Ta talo nga lo pin ju du bare. Sang cha bare ya wo pe chong song number 2 gi wone ko kale gya ba thong so. 아니 아버도 가장 디 담자 소인 다제 단야를 랭게리 저 한산 야 보시고 셈을 가와시라 계속 아니 두지 시슈인 당고 결혼 졸라.
So this year's time or this year's section is over. All of you really did really well. And first you came here and you made an effort, but the result, especially after yesterday's debate, it was really very encouraging. And so I was extremely happy and pleased. So I wanted to thank you all for doing this first. And because the result was so encouraging this year, again, for being able to do it next year, may we be able to do it next year. So please generate a wish or a motivation to be able to do it, and then set your intention to be able to come and fulfill that result when we get there.
Samlo namda nyaman dindi chuna samdi gu yorde ko sambazamgi dugumindwa o di indi da di thadan sotoye di rimbuchi kelen nambare rimbuchi genshi jeje di chegin seje di jebar madu shamba halam di sotoye me yorawchire o di indi rimbuchi din dugimelam re zo o di indi rimbuchi layang kadim che shwe.
And then just having the wish or thinking about wanting to do something doesn't necessarily bring it to completion. And so the fact that we could put this together and that this activity followed through was because Rinpoche accepted it. And then through Rinpoche's prayers and aspirations, this whole thing was we were able to sustain and bring this activity to completion. And so I would like to thank Rinpoche also for this. So the
Kiranzo Karsori. Game machine inji bije stadio sorojo game machine jaga bije tagin kartagin pepe bije sorojo wala sabdel de adisha bele kirazor ke kuch ko mani ni kare lamala atinde adisha la ya tuji che kadin che shwe.
And then because if Atisha had not been giving subtitles, it's like you would have been watching a foreign language film the whole time and you wouldn't have understood anything. So I would like to thank him as well.
That movie
If you watch a movie, at least the images can give you some meaning. Thank you. The text is in this one, it's on page 197, revealing one's personal realizations, noble pursuit. 197.